Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Books and Bytes. Today, we're diving deep into, well, I'd say a pretty foundational text in the social sciences,
Okay.
Gary Becker's The Economic Approach to Human Behavior.
Right.
In this work, Becker, he kind of lays out this really powerful and sometimes provocative argument
Yeah.
that the principles of economics, the focus on rational individuals, maximizing their well-being when faced with constraints, that these principles aren't just limited to like buying and selling stuff.
Right.
He argues that this framework can give us like these profound insights into all sorts of human actions,
Yeah.
from decisions about family and crime to like even discrimination and social interactions. So we'll be exploring how Becker systematically builds this case across all these different topics. We'll stick pretty closely to his core arguments, how he presents them in the main text of the book itself.
Okay.
And along the way, we'll for sure highlight a couple of his most impactful statements, maybe some of his most famous lines.
Sounds good.
So let's jump right in. What's the initial groundwork, that Becker lays for this expansive view of economics?
Well, Becker really starts by fundamentally reframing what economics is all about.
Okay.
He makes this crucial distinction right from the start.
Okay.
He's saying it's not the subject matter itself that defines economics.
Okay.
It's the unique approach it takes.
Okay, I see.
So he points out that many of the things that economists study, like decisions about having children or engaging in crime,
Yeah.
these are examined by, sociologists, psychologists, all sorts of folks.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
But what makes economics different, Becker argues, is this consistent reliance on a certain set of assumptions
Gotcha.
about how people make choices.
Okay. So it's not what we're looking at, but how we're looking at it.
Exactly.
That's interesting. So then what are the key elements of this economic approach?
Right.
The one that Becker is championing as this universally applicable thing.
Yeah. So he really outlines three main principles.
Okay.
So first, there's the idea of maximizing behavior, that people try to get the most satisfaction or utility possible given their particular situation.
Okay. Makes sense.
Then the second principle is that, people have relatively stable preferences.
Okay.
Now, he acknowledges that, of course, tastes can change over time, over the long run.
Right, right.
But he argues that in the short to medium term, they're stable enough,
Okay.
for us to analyze them in a meaningful way.
Gotcha.
And then the third pillar is the concept of markets.
Okay.
And Becker actually interprets this super broadly.
Right.
It's not just about formal markets with actual prices.
Yeah.
He's talking about any situation where people interact to try to achieve their goals.
Okay.
And these situations often work under what he calls shadow prices.
Right. Shadow prices.
Yeah.
That's a key idea he brings up pretty early on.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
How does that broaden how we understand costs and, the choices that we make?
So Becker argues that even when you don't have explicit money being exchanged,
Yeah.
goods and activities still have a kind of cost, an implied cost.
Okay.
And it's usually tied to the value of the time it takes to get them or to do them.
Oh.
Imagine you're choosing between cooking dinner at home versus, ordering takeout.
Yeah.
So the shadow price of that home-cooked meal, it's not just the ingredients. It
Okay.
also includes the value of the time you spent shopping for the food, prepping it, cooking it, and even the time you spend cleaning up afterward.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And Becker argues that changes in these relative shadow prices, these are huge drivers of our decisions.
That's
So
right.
if the time cost of something goes up, we're probably less likely to do it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Right.
It makes you think about all those everyday little decisions where we're constantly weighing our time versus money or effort.
Right.
Even if we don't actively realize we're doing that.
Yeah.
Now, the idea of rationality in economics, that often gets a lot of attention. So what's Becker's take on how rational human behavior really is?
So he acknowledges that, we don't always have all the information.
Right.
And we don't always make the absolute best choices.
Yeah, of course.
But he argues that the economic approach, it doesn't require perfect rationality.
Okay.
It's more about, assuming what we might call bounded rationality.
Okay.
That individuals basically make the best choices they can with the information they have at the time,
Okay.
Given the limitations they're facing.
Right.
He even brings up Jeremy Bentham and his idea that passion calculates.
Oh, interesting.
suggesting that even our emotions,
Yeah.
they're often connected to like a subconscious kind of weighing of costs and benefits.
Okay.
So the key isn't really about perfect calculation.
Yeah.
It's more about this consistent tendency to act in ways that we think are going to like improve our overall well-being.
So it's more about the general direction of our behavior rather than like perfect execution every time.
Yeah, exactly.
Now, it's fascinating how Becker took this like core set of ideas
Mm-hmm.
and actually applied them to this huge range of human activities.
Right.
What was like the driving force behind this broadening of the economic lens?
I mean, a good example is his early work on racial discrimination.
Okay, yeah.
That was a prime example of him applying economic principles to like a really complex social issue.
Yeah.
And then from there, he gradually like expanded this framework,
Okay.
exploring how these concepts of maximizing behavior, stable preferences, and markets could help us understand things like fertility, education, how we use our time, even crime, marriage, social interactions.
Wow, that's like a really diverse set of topics.
It is.
And his success in, coming up with compelling insights across those seemingly totally different fields, I guess that just reinforced his belief that this economic approach really could apply universally.
Right. It's like a unified theory of human behavior almost.
Yeah, I see that. And this whole idea of like using this consistent framework to try to understand all human behavior,
Yeah.
I mean, that wasn't totally new, right?
Yeah.
Becker mentioned some folks who were thinking along those lines before.
Oh, yeah, for sure. He points to people like Adam Smith,
Okay.
who, often use economic reasoning to try to understand political behavior.
Okay.
And then there's Jeremy Bentham with his focus on that pleasure-pain calculation.
Right.
That idea that it's a driving force behind all our actions,
Yeah.
not just those related to money.
Okay.
But while those earlier thinkers, they kind of laid some groundwork,
Mm-hmm.
what Becker did was develop a much more rigorous and systematic theoretical framework,
Okay.
and one with testable implications across a wider range of behaviors.
It's like he took these like initial sparks of an idea and built this like comprehensive intellectual structure around them.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
So as we like dig into some of the specific areas Becker examines,
Right.
one that might, kind of raise eyebrows is his perspective on something is personal
Yeah,
and seemingly non-economic as like suicide.
right.
How does his framework even approach such a, profound decision?
Well, Becker's suggesting that even a decision to end one's life,
Yeah.
this can be looked at through the lens of individual choice within certain constraints.
Okay.
He argues that people make decisions based on, their overall well-being,
Okay.
and that's defined really broadly. And tragically, in some circumstances,
Yeah.
a person might just rationally come to the conclusion
Yeah.
that the costs of continuing to live, they simply outweigh the benefits they see,
Right.
given their preferences and their options at that moment.
Yeah.
So it's not about like condoning or judging it. It's more about trying to understand that decision-making process,
Right.
Through his particular framework.
Yeah, it's a really like stark way to apply his principles, kind of pushing the boundaries of what we usually think of as economics.
Right.
He also looks into, the complexities of choosing a mate,
Yes.
which is something, most people have really strong personal feelings about.
Of course.
So what insights does like this economic approach offer into who we end up marrying?
Well, Becker looks at mate selection as like this process of individuals trying to maximize their utility within what he calls marriage market.
The marriage market. Okay.
Right.
Interesting.
And he suggests that people tend to pair up based on all kinds of factors,
Okay.
including similarities in things like education, intelligence, their backgrounds.
Okay, so people who are alike in those ways.
Right. Economists call that positive assortative mating.
Okay.
But he also considers how differences, like in their potential to earn wages.
How those differences can lead to mutually beneficial pairings,
Okay.
through specialization within the household.
Interesting.
So the basic idea is that people seek out partners who are going to like add to their overall well-being.
So it's kind of like a marketplace
Yeah.
where people are sizing up potential partners
Right.
based on what they bring to the table.
Exactly.
Both in terms of like shared values and maybe complementary skills.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And he even applies this lens to fields like intellectual and artistic pursuits,
Right.
which, some might see as purely driven by passion or intrinsic motivation.
Mm-hmm.
What's his take on that?
Well, he argues that even in these fields, people are still responding to incentives,
Okay.
whether those are like financial rewards, recognition from their peers, or even the satisfaction they get from the creative work itself.
Yeah, I see that.
And he suggests that how talent and effort are allocated in those intellectual and artistic endeavors.
Right. That's influenced by the costs and benefits, just like it is in, more traditional economic activities.
Right.
So passion and intrinsic motivation are definitely important, no doubt.
Yeah.
But Becker's framework suggests they're operating within this context of individual choice,
Okay.
and how resources get allocated.
It's a consistent theme in his work, right?
Yeah.
That underlying logic of rational choice,
Hmm.
even in areas we might not immediately think of as like economic.
Right.
Now, this broad application of the economic approach has gotten its share of criticism over the years.
Of course.
What are some of the main objections, and how does Becker address them?
So one common criticism is that, other social sciences,
Yeah.
they often focus on things like irrationality, social norms, cultural influences,
Right.
which on the surface seem to contradict this economic focus on, stable preferences and rational decision making.
Yeah, for sure.
Becker, he acknowledges that these factors are important, but he argues that they don't necessarily invalidate the economic approach.
Okay.
He suggests that what might look like irrational behavior, sometimes it's just the result of not having enough information.
Okay.
Or because of the cost of getting that information.
Right.
And while he gets that preferences can evolve over time,
Yeah.
he still maintains that for many types of analysis,
Yeah.
assuming they're relatively stable is a really useful and powerful tool.
Makes sense.
And he emphasizes that the economic approach can actually incorporate insights from other fields
Okay.
by treating those social norms and cultural factors as influencing the constraints and opportunities that people face.
So instead of seeing it as this competing framework,
Right.
Becker's saying the economic approach is more like this foundational way of understanding behavior
Yeah,
that can be enhanced by those other insights.
exactly.
It's not saying it's the only answer, just a really powerful lens for looking at this wide range of human actions.
Mm-hmm.
So let's dig into some more specific applications he talks about.
Okay.
His work on discrimination is especially influential.
Yeah, definitely.
So how does this economic approach help us understand something as complex as discrimination?
Well, Becker's analysis really centers on this idea of a taste for discrimination.
A taste for discrimination.
Yeah, it's a willingness to give up some economic benefit
Yeah.
to avoid interacting with or employing people from a certain group.
Okay, so prejudice in this framework has an economic cost for the person who's prejudiced.
Right, exactly.
Interesting.
And Becker shows how this taste for discrimination can actually lead to differences in wages and job opportunities
Okay,
for that targeted group.
right.
He also makes this distinction between economic minorities and what we call numerical minorities.
Economic minorities, okay.
Right. So for discrimination to actually lower a group's economic status in a competitive market, that group needs to be an economic minority, meaning they control a smaller share of the total resources, regardless of how many of them there actually are.
So economic vulnerability can be more important than just sheer numbers when it comes to the effects of discrimination in a free market.
Yeah, that's a key insight.
That's interesting. What about the economic consequences for the group that's doing the discriminating?
Right.
Do they actually benefit financially from that?
Well, Becker argues that in most cases, they don't.
Okay.
Discrimination usually hurts the economic well-being of the group doing it.
Really?
Yeah, by limiting their pool of potential employees or customers, or trading partners based on prejudice,
Right.
they're reducing overall efficiency and productivity
I see.
and therefore lowering their own potential income.
So they're paying a price for their discriminatory preferences.
Exactly.
That's a pretty compelling argument for why, from a purely economic standpoint, discrimination is just inefficient
Right.
and bad for everyone involved.
Yeah, it's a lose-lose situation.
So Becker also applies his ideas to government intervention, particularly in the context of monopolies.
Right.
What's his economic perspective on that?
Well, traditional economics often focuses on the inefficiencies that monopolies create.
Yep.
And they advocate for, government intervention through things like antitrust laws or regulations.
Yeah.
Becker comes at it from a slightly different angle.
Okay.
He argues that in a democracy, moving an activity from the private sector to the government, it doesn't really eliminate competition.
Okay.
It just shifts the arena of competition.
I see.
Instead of firms competing for consumers and their money,
Yeah.
you have political parties competing for votes and influence.
So those competitive pressures don't just go away, they just change form.
Right.
It reminds us that even in these contexts that don't seem like markets,
Yeah,
there are still these underlying forces of competition at work.
absolutely.
So then he turns his attention to, well, a topic that's often considered totally outside the realm of traditional economics, crime.
Mm-hmm.
How does Becker approach criminal behavior?
He treats it as a rational choice.
Okay.
Made by individuals who are weighing the potential benefits of criminal activity
Okay.
against the costs,
Right.
which include like the chance of getting caught
Yeah.
and how severe the punishment might be.
Okay.
So he's arguing that the same principles of, maximizing utility with constraints,
Right.
ones we've been talking about,
Yeah.
those can apply to understanding why people engage in crime too.
So it's kind of like a cost-benefit analysis.
Exactly.
Just like when you're deciding, should I buy a new car or go on vacation?
Right, exactly.
So in the context of crime then, what are the key costs and benefits that Becker highlights?
Well, the benefits are, whatever the person hopes to gain from the crime itself.
Okay.
Could be money in the case of theft or some other kind of satisfaction. But then the costs, those include, the direct costs of committing the crime, like resources or tools they need,
Okay.
plus the opportunity cost of their time, the time spent planning and carrying out the crime.
Yeah, right.
But the most important cost is the expected cost of getting caught and punished,
Okay.
which depends on the likelihood of conviction and how harsh the penalty is.
Okay.
So Becker argues that any changes in these costs and benefits,
Right.
those are going to have an impact on the overall level of crime.
Makes sense. If the potential rewards seem bigger
Yeah,
or the risks seem smaller, we'd expect to see more crime.
right, and vice versa.
Becker also goes into the economics of different types of punishment, like fines versus going to prison.
Right.
What's his take on that?
Well, he points out that fines are usually a more economically efficient way to punish someone
Okay.
because it's basically a direct transfer of money from the offender to the state
Mm-hmm.
with relatively low social costs compared to locking someone up. Because prison involves huge expenses for, running the prisons.
Yeah.
And then you lose the prisoner's productive capacity.
Okay. Yeah.
So he suggests fines can be the best punishment in a lot of cases,
Okay.
especially for crimes where the damage can easily be measured in monetary terms.
It's like a very practical perspective,
Mm-hmm.
focused on minimizing the total cost to society
Right.
while still trying to deter crime.
Exactly.
He even touches on the idea of using fines to compensate for activities that create like negative externalities.
Right.
Where you basically align the private cost with the actual social cost.
Mm-hmm.
Now, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about another major part of Becker's work.
Mm-hmm.
His ideas about how we allocate our time and the whole concept of household production.
Yeah.
This really broadened the scope of economic analysis, moving beyond just those typical market transactions.
Oh, definitely. This was really groundbreaking stuff.
Yeah.
Becker recognized that a huge part of economic activity actually happens inside households. And it involves how we allocate our time to things that aren't directly bought and sold.
Right.
So he introduces this concept of full income,
Okay.
which includes not just the money you earn,
Yeah.
but also what your time is worth.
The income. Okay.
Right. And he argues that households basically combine goods that they buy
Yeah.
with their own time
Okay.
to produce these essential commodities that give them utility, like
Okay.
meals or childcare, even leisure.
So when we think about the cost of something, it's not just the money.
Right.
It's also like the value of the time we put into it.
Exactly.
This has implications for all kinds of decisions, from how we enjoy our free time to how families structure themselves.
Absolutely. Becker's framework helps us understand things like, how time is becoming more valuable in modern economies
Okay.
and how that's shaping what consumers choose, like the demand for things that save time.
Yes, that makes sense.
It also provides a really useful way to analyze household decisions,
Yeah.
things like who works, how many kids to have, even how chores are split up.
Yeah.
He actually developed what he called the new theory of consumer behavior based on these ideas.
Okay.
And that shifted the focus away from simply consuming goods
Okay.
to actively producing utility within the household.
And this new theory of consumer behavior, it lets economists look at a much wider range of decisions
Right.
using their standard tools.
Exactly.
It's about understanding those underlying production processes inside the household
Yeah.
and how they change when prices or incomes change.
Right.
He even argues that this approach can help explain behavior that seems irrational.
That's right. He suggests that, if we focus on those underlying preferences
Okay.
and the changing costs of household production,
Yeah.
we can often reinterpret behaviors that might seem irrational as actually making sense,
Okay.
given those specific circumstances.
I see.
He also makes this really interesting point
Yeah.
that even if individual people sometimes act randomly,
Okay.
the bigger picture, the aggregate outcomes in markets can still show a kind of rationality
Okay.
because of these averaging effects.
Interesting. It reminds us that even with all our individual, quirks and inconsistencies,
Yeah.
those broader patterns of behavior,
Right.
we can still understand them using an economic lens.
Right.
So, nearing the end of our deep dive here,
Yeah.
Becker also uses his framework to study marriage, fertility, and the family,
Mm-hmm.
which, as he notes, was initially met with some skepticism from other economists.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
So, what are some of the core ideas from this part of his work?
Well, in this part, Becker expands his new theory of the household
Okay.
to analyze what goes on within families.
Okay.
He's looking at decisions like getting married, having kids, and the division of labor within the family.
Yeah.
And he's treating those as economic choices too, choices made to maximize the well-being of each family member.
Yep.
He sees marriage as a partnership that happens when both people think they'll be better off together
Right.
than they would be on their own,
Right.
taking into account things like, shared expenses, specialization in housework, and emotional support.
So there's an underlying economic logic, even in these decisions that we often think of as purely emotional or social.
Right.
What about his approach to fertility, to the decision to have children?
So Becker analyzes that decision by looking at the costs and benefits involved,
Okay.
not just the financial costs, but also the opportunity cost of the parents' time, and then also the satisfaction or utility they expect to get from having children.
Right. Right.
He also explores how things like, better access to contraception and rising wages,
Okay.
how those have influenced how many kids people choose to have.
Interesting.
He came up with the concepts of the quantity and quality of children,
Okay.
suggesting that families are often balancing, having more kids
Yeah.
versus investing more in each individual child.
Right. So it's a trade-off.
Yeah.
And this gives us a way to understand
Mhm.
how economic factors can actually shape these fundamental demographic trends.
Exactly.
So lastly, Becker applies his economic approach to the realm of social interactions.
Right.
He's looking at how our behavior is affected by what other people do and how they're doing.
Right. So he brings in this concept of social capital,
Okay.
and he analyzes how people invest in their social relationships and
Yeah.
how these connections can affect their economic outcomes.
Oh.
He also explores the economics of altruism
Mm-hmm.
and how caring for others fits into this idea of maximizing individual utility.
Okay.
He's famous for this rotten kid theorem.
Yeah, yeah.
It shows how even kids who seem selfish,
Right.
they might act in ways that actually benefit their family
Okay.
if one of the parents is, altruistic enough.
That's fascinating. The idea that altruism at one level can lead to seemingly self-interested behavior at another.
Yeah.
It really highlights how complex those relationships within families and groups can be.
Mm-hmm.
So as we wrap up our deep dive,
Yeah.
it's really clear that the economic approach to human behavior offers this incredibly comprehensive,
Mm-hmm.
often surprising way to look at the world around us.
Definitely.
Do you have any final thoughts or maybe one of those famous passages you wanted to share?
Yeah, actually, there's one that's super often cited.
Okay.
It really captures the heart of his argument.
Okay.
He writes, the combined assumptions of maximizing behavior, market equilibrium, and stable preferences used relentlessly and unflinchingly form the heart of the economic approach as I view it.
Wow, that's really direct.
Yeah.
It really underscores his commitment to applying those core principles everywhere.
Exactly. And another really powerful statement,
Okay.
it kind of echoes Bentham. It's where he says that the economic approach can be used to understand all human behavior, be it behavior involving money prices or imputed shadow prices, repeated or infrequent decisions, emotional or unemotional ends, rich or poor persons, men or women, adults or children, brilliant or stupid persons, patients or therapists, businessmen or politicians, teachers or students.
He wasn't like shying away from making a bold claim.
Yep.
Becker's work really pushes us to look deeper,
Mm-hmm.
beyond just the surface of what people do.
Right.
And think about that underlying logic of choices and consequences,
Yeah.
even in areas that seem far removed from what we traditionally think of as economics.
It definitely changes how you view things.
Really gives you a lot to think about.